The latest rounds of sanctions against Russia are like the 345th Chinese warning. There were sanctions from hell, there were sanctions from the backside, but so far they haven't put any serious pressure on the Kremlin. Do they make life difficult for Russia? They make things harder, but not much, and not for decision makers. Authorities don't care about those who aren't making decisions. They're used to eating sausage and wearing Chinese dresses. And that's fine, that's it. Honestly, before that, I never really looked into or tried to understand sanctions because no matter what was offered to me, I knew that Biden was one of those people, or his, so to speak, people. These are the very people who pushed Putin into war, and as I understand it, they also pushed Zelensky and Ukraine into war. On the other hand, I wonder why would they suddenly put pressure on Russia to stop the war? And the European Union, which was buying a lot of Russian gas and oil 3.5 years ago, why would it suddenly want to quarrel with Russia? We'll pretend, but not really quarrel. But still, I decided to look into it because this is the first time that something more or less serious has happened involving Trump, who, in general, so to speak, really turned the European Union upside down. I already talked about this, I think, yesterday or the day before, that the European Union, so to speak, was left behind. Out of 50% of all the hydrocarbons it used to import from Russia, now only 13% remain. They also promised to stop buying the remaining 13% from Russia within 1.5 to 2 years. It doesn't matter right now. I mean, something is happening that shows that, well, that's enough already. So to speak, they're tired of the war going on there. So, the new United States sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil were announced on October 22, that is now in 2025. They are aimed at increasing economic pressure on Russia and its energy sector, in connection with the conflict that just won't end in Ukraine. The United States Department of the Treasury explained the introduction of the restrictions with two reasons. First, Russia's lack of serious commitment to the peace process and President Putin's refusal to stop military actions. As I understand it, so to speak, Putin almost promised several times. In other words, he promised in such a way that he could later say, "No, I didn't promise, I just said it," and so on. Which, as I understand it, again left our side in a state of bewilderment. So the United States Secretary of the Treasury, that's Scott Bessent, stated that oil revenues from Rosneft and Lukoil are, so to speak, direct support for the Kremlin's war machine, and that's why these companies became the target of sanctions. So, what exactly are the sanctions and restrictions about? Sanctions are restrictions. Previously, only the main structures of Rosneft and Lukoil were sanctioned, but now all 34 of their subsidiaries are also included. They have different ones. Total is 304. All assets of the mentioned companies and their United States branches, or those controlled by American entities, have been frozen. It turned out to be approximately $2 billion. Well, it's not a huge amount of money, but it's significant. I mean, it's not huge. Huge for Russia as a whole, but significant for everyone else. Any operations and transactions by American citizens and companies with these organizations, that is, including Lukoil and all their subsidiaries, are now prohibited. Yes, this includes foreign counterparties and intermediaries. It is advised to end operations with these companies within a month, not a year, not like by January 1, 2039, not even a month. The question is, how much does this complicate Putin's life and his desire to stop the pressure? When I say Putin, I mean the whole top leadership, everyone at the top living in luxury. So, sanctions are part of the president's administration's strategy of applying pressure, sort of, which combines diplomatic pressure with economic tools. Washington says these measures aim to motivate, not punish. That's basically, call me anything, just don't put me in the oven. Encouraging positive changes in Russia's behavior. Well, something like if you behave well, we won't impose sanctions, but if you behave badly, then we will. In other words, ending the fighting and joining negotiations. Thus, the point of the new sanctions is to try to cut off the Kremlin's key sources of oil revenue and to restrict the international operations of both Rosneft and Lukoil. The United States sanctions, the ones from October 22 aimed at these two companies, will have a noticeable negative impact, maybe short-term, but still, on Russia's oil exports and the revenues of these companies, especially, as I already mentioned, in the short term. Then we'll talk a bit about how their revenues will drop and why. Add Europe's shift from Russian gas to this, and it's clear the smell. The West is lost for Russia. By Russia, I mean the multi-resource suppliers. So will there be a replacement in the East? The United States Treasury blocked transactions of companies and their subsidiaries with foreign counterparties and warned foreign partners about the risk of secondary sanctions. I'll talk about this in more detail later. This will lead to a temporary reduction in export volumes by 10–15%. That's about 600,000 and 800,000 barrels per day. According to energy analysts, Russia will likely try to compensate for this loss by increasing supplies to China and India. But logistical challenges and the need to use intermediaries, transportation, and cargo insurance costs, I'll talk about that now as well. Actually, here Europe and America have tricked Russia. The profitability and financial position of Rosneft and Lukoil will take a hit due to currency exposure and margins. Well, margin is the difference between what you spent and what you received minus what you spent. Restrictions on access to Western markets and services will immediately complicate the extraction of hard-to-recover oil. In Russia now, it's already 30% of the total volume compared to very little before. And without Western technology, spare parts, and so on, they won't be able to extract that oil from there. The destruction of intermediary chains and bypass routes will inevitably lead to increased operating costs and reduced profitability. Does reduced profitability mean a lower margin? Against the backdrop of expectations, disruptions in Russian oil supplies. So Brent has already risen by about 5%, which of course partially compensates for the losses of Russian companies in the domestic market. However, the long-term effect will be negative. Export revenues will decrease, and tax revenues to the budget will decline, because what do they pay into the budget from? From revenue, right? And the ruble is not about turnover. The turnover might be huge, but the revenue is zero or even negative, and the ruble will most likely continue to fall. And the European Union has issued the 19th package of sanctions against Russia, a significant part of which is aimed at ships and companies transporting Russian oil. They came up with the so-called shadow fleet, meaning they traveled around the world buying up ships on behalf of all sorts of... I'm talking about Liberia and all sorts of places like Egypt. I don't know, some small countries. They were buying ships there, tankers that were 20, 30 years old, released a long time ago. That is, they already, so to speak, really need repairs, but they can still operate normally. And they acquired something like 1,100. I had the numbers somewhere. I'll announce them later. Ships like these, and what do? So one ship comes in, it goes to the port, loads up with oil, and heads out to sea. There it meets with a shady ship like that. The oil is transferred there, and this shady ship goes to India, unloads in India, and India processes this oil, mixing it with something else that it bought from other places. And now, where did the oil come from? No one knows where the oil came from. Here are the oil products, like gasoline, fuel oil, kerosene, and others they sell. So what are the main measures against these tankers? Right now, 120 new tankers suspected of transporting Russian oil in violation of sanctions have been added to the sanctions list, which brings the total number of restricted tankers to about, I think, 560 units, or 560 as of now. Let me recall such vessels now. Such vessels are now banned from entering the ports of European Union countries, Italy, the United Kingdom, and accordingly the United States of America, and these vessels are also prohibited from using European insurance services, which is extremely important, as well as brokerage and logistics companies. A logistics company that guides the vessel along its route. And this is where the problem lies, as they say. You can't insure it, you can't repair it, you can't enter ports, and you have to take a very long route. European Union countries have been given the right to inspect suspicious ships on the open sea. Pretty serious, yeah. Such an attack on our ship happened openly. If there are grounds to believe that they are connected to the supply of Russian oil. So that's how it is. The captain is in charge, sees the ship and says, "I have a suspicion and I have grounds for it. Do you agree with them?" The assistant says, "I think so too." Now, there are grounds to believe since two people think so. They went, stopped him, searched him. This is a serious blow to Russia. The new forms provide for the application of Article 110 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which allows for boarding and the seizure of vessels without national affiliation. So, for example, a Libyan flag is flying, but we suspect that it's Russian. The main goal is to block the ways to bypass the oil embargo and deprive Moscow of the income it receives through shadow routes, where, as I said, oil is transferred from ship to ship in international waters and resold as if it were of unknown origin. It filled up on its own and no one knows how. I was sailing, then suddenly the ship was full of oil. The European Commission states that the new monitoring system creates a basis for total violation of oversight over Russian oil shipments by sea. I don't believe it. That's it. The only question is whether to share information with Europeans about Russian and suspicious vessel movements, because we have an incredible number of satellites up there, which, so to speak, can all send out beeps, signals, and produce all sorts of things. Here are some additional aspects. A planned restriction will limit refueling and servicing of tankers linked to Russia. All right. By 2027, the European Union will fully ban imports of Russian liquefied gas, in addition to pipeline gas, and to tighten sanctions against major energy companies. Well, including Rosneft and Gazpromneft, any of them. Thus, the essence of the new European sanctions is not only to block individual ships, but also to undermine the entire logistics infrastructure, that is, how they travel, where they transfer the oil, how they are not stopped. In other words, all of this ensures the maritime export of Russian oil from tankers and insurers to port services and intermediaries. Well, and the European Union. Sanctions against ships transporting Russian oil are aimed at gradually paralyzing the logistical infrastructure of the shadow fleet, the key tool through which Moscow continued to export oil bypassing the price cap. And we, meaning America and Europe, everyone else just turned a blind eye. But it seems we won't do that anymore. At least, editor, we won't be waving a stick and shouting. According to the latest estimates from analysts at Global Market Intelligence and the New York Times, the Russian shadow fleet consists of about 900 to 1,100 tankers, which is roughly 17% of all oil tankers in the world. But the average age of such vessels is over 20 years, and most of them were acquired through shell companies. In 2025, the European Union has already blacklisted 560 tankers, and 560 have already been added, and in the 19th package, another 120 will be added. So, look, that means we already have, yes, 680, which is almost about 70% of the entire shadow fleet. Approximately, yes, 680 out of 1,000, that's about 70%. What are you doing? Are you making the operation even more complicated? These vessels are banned from entering the ports of the European Union, the United Kingdom, America, I think Canada as well. I haven't checked, but I think also Australia, Japan, and I suspect South Korea. They have been deprived of insurance coverage from Europeans, and some of them risk being detained or arrested for violating the sanctions regime. By the way, there have already been 2 cases of tankers being detained, I think in the waters of France and the waters of Estonia. Economic and trade consequences. We've already discussed the rising costs. Circumventing sanctions now costs much more, and insurance for these vessels is pricier. I want to cheer you up by 5 times. Freight rates for oil transportation have increased by approximately 40%. That means Russia is getting significantly less from selling oil, Not pennies, but still much less money, and they are also forced to sell it below the market price. The attractiveness for buyers is decreasing. Indian and Chinese importers have started avoiding deals with the gray fleet, well, fearing secondary sanctions, compression of export routes. Russia is losing access to safe channels, which forces it to use longer and more expensive routes, that is, through the Suez Canal, the Indian Ocean, and so on. European Union and United Kingdom pressure makes shadow fleet oil exports less sustainable and much more costly. Many note that although supplies will not stop, the export structure instantly becomes at least unstable and profitability decreases due to the increased costs I told you about. In other words, the new sanctions are gradually turning the shadow fleet from a tool for bypassing restrictions into an expensive burden, limiting the profitability of Russian oil exports and narrowing export opportunities, maybe by trading globally. The sanctions announced by the United States, European Union, and United Kingdom in October 2025 were likely the largest since the initial restrictions in 2022, and they are aimed at restructuring Russia's entire financial and energy model. These sanctions are well thought out. They're not random, as they say. Experts note that these measures create serious long-term pressure, although they do not lead to an immediate economic catastrophe. They limit Russia's access to international finance, technology, insurance, and the transportation market, creating an effective economic stagnation with a gradual erosion of income. That's the clever phrase I came up with. According to estimates by the Geider Institute for Economic Policy, sanctions could reduce Russia's potential gross domestic product growth by 1 to 2% at first, and if they remain in place for a year, by up to 7 to 10% of gross domestic product by 2026. Subtitles. The strikes by the United States against Rosneft and Lukoil, synchronized with European sanctions against tankers and the shadow fleet, directly target Moscow's main source of foreign currency revenue. These measures reduce export volumes, increase logistics costs, and limit insurance and transshipment infrastructure, which inevitably lowers profitability. This is what matters for Russia. London and Brussels have both expanded bank restrictions at the same time. The new rules now cover payment systems in yuan and dirhams. Dirhams, I think they're called. I thought it was drachmas, but I think it's spelled dirhams. Dirhams. What makes it harder to bypass sanctions through Asia? This is already leading to an increase in borrowing costs. And also that means you have to pay even more for capital, which leads to a decrease. Well, in general, the federal budget deficit by the fall of 2025 exceeded 3.7 trillion rubles, I mean the Russian one. And that's 4 trillion worse than last year. The rise in prices for imported equipment components, as well as restrictions in technology, are leading to a slowdown in industrial production and a depreciation of real incomes. Japan took part in this. Australia took part in this. Foreign banks, traders, and service companies conducting significant operations for Lukoil or Rosneft can easily fall under United States secondary sanctions. What does inclusion, continuation, exclusion, or rather restriction on dollar transactions and exclusion from the American financial system mean? And there is no other system. If not death, does it mean paralysis? Banks that have correspondent accounts in the United States stop working with payments even through third-party jurisdictions. In general, United States secondary sanctions are aimed at foreign companies and banks from third countries that help Russia bypass direct restrictions, and any company involved in the purchase or sale of Russian oil, petrochemicals, or fuel from Rosneft, Lukoil, and other sanctioned companies can be denied access to dollar transactions in the American banking system. Well, in general, companies from China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and so on have already been affected. So, well, let's try to sum it up. Another $1 billion of Russia's assets have been frozen. 70% of the tankers they used, pretending they had nothing to do with them, have been identified and are now banned from entering ports and being serviced, and they can be stopped and inspected in the middle of the sea at any moment. Companies from countries that bought oil from Russia, then processed and sold it, pretending it wasn't Russian, could end up under the same sanctions. Russia. Any bank that works with Russia's oil and gas industry will be automatically removed from dollar operations, which are the main ones in the world today and without which banks cannot survive. The cost of transportation is increasing, insurance costs are noticeably rising, the number of intermediaries is growing, and in order to sell oil, you have to sell it at reduced prices. So, a decrease in the selling price, along with a significant increase in costs, plus the risk that oil tankers will be detained or arrested, the oil will be sold, and the proceeds will be put somewhere Russia can't access them. At the same time, Ukraine is attacking oil refineries and other energy facilities on Russian territory, making oil production even more costly and uncertain. At any time, the oil being transported could be like that. Its products can be attacked by Ukrainian drones, blown up and burned. In the same way, any port where Russian oil is loaded can be attacked, and then the ship will burn. Russia will face significant pressure from the United States, Australia, Japan, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine. Perhaps Trump's next step will be to refuse to buy products from any country that uses Russian oil to manufacture those products. In any case, this is no longer a blow to consumer goods or to certain individuals with a ban on entering Italy for vacation. As I already said, these slowly but steadily expanding sanctions, which also affect counterparties who buy, insure, service, finance, and so on, will all eventually fall away. Some will be forced out, as some will decide it's not worth it, and so on. They will be tracked down, the Americans will track them down and impose bans on them, and they will be afraid. Because they understand that breaking off potential relations with the United States is much worse than with anyone else. This market is about 40 times bigger than the Russian one. It looks like these sanctions will come into full effect around the spring of 2025. And before that, I really hope to see some steps taken by Russia towards ending the war. Because now there's a stick or a whip, I'm not sure what's more accurate, that can be used against Putin, against Russia. The income of the O0 cooperative, they don't like it when their money is taken away. That's it. We're finishing here. Until next time.